Hello and welcome to this, our second episode of A Word from the Wise. Today I'm joined by Dr Will McNeill, who's going to be discussing perception as a source of knowledge. Within the A-level philosophy syllabus, it falls under topic code 3.1.2, and we're going to be discussing Locke and Berkeley's approaches to what is real and what we can know about what there is. So Will, if you could start us off with a definition as to what perception means to philosophers, and we can go from there.
Great. So today we are going to be talking about perception, both the nature of perceptual experience and the way in which it can be a source of knowledge for us. So if you think about it, an awful lot of our knowledge comes from perception, and today I'm just going to be thinking about visual perception, right? Think about the room that you're in or the place where you're at. You're getting knowledge all of the time. Lots of very interesting, important knowledge about the nature of the space that you're in, the objects which are in it, and so on, right? And it seems like that knowledge is coming from your perceptual experience. So you're seeing the objects in your room, you're seeing the books, the bottles of water, whatever it is, and it's because you've seen those things that you know that they're there and you know where they are. So, in general, we can ask two questions about perception and its role in knowledge, right? On the one hand, we can think about the nature of perceptual experiences themselves, right? What kinds of mental states are perceptual experiences? And we can also think about how those kinds of states could be sources of knowledge for us. And it's really important to distinguish those two questions, right? There's a clear interaction between them. It might be that some of the things you want to say about the nature of perceptual experience make it hard to understand how perceptual experiences could be sources of knowledge for us. So there's going to be an interaction, but these are two different questions. One is metaphysical in nature. We're asking what there is, what the nature of the things that there are is. And the other is epistemological in nature, right? We're asking how we get knowledge, how we get justification for the beliefs that we have about our world. So let's think first about the nature of perceptual experience. And as ever in philosophy, the place to start is just to think of what you might call the lived experience, right? What are the phenomena that we want to understand and that we want to explain? So thinking about visual perception, right, seeing objects and features in your environment, it looks like there are a number of things we can say about how perception seems to you. And that's, as ever in philosophy, the right starting point. So when you think about whatever the objects are in your environment, so for me there's a bottle of water here, it looks like there's a sense in which I'm genuinely in contact with that bottle of water by seeing it. Right? We might almost say that it's a constituent, that it's a part of my experience, this bottle of water on the table. So one thing we can say about the manifest image of perception, right, about how perception seems to us, is that it seems to us that it provides us with a sort of openness to the world and with a contact with the objects in that world. The objects around us seem to be genuinely present to us, genuinely present in our experiences. And when we try and reflect on the nature of our experiences themselves, we find ourselves talking in ways which make it sound as if we're talking about the objects around us. So if I try and describe my experience of the bottle, I end up using words that look like they are describing the bottle itself. So I'm looking at the bottle, and when I try and describe my experience of the bottle, it looks like I'm just describing the bottle. Okay, what's my experience like? Well, it's like there's a transparent cylindrical object with a blue lid in front of me, right, that's warping in interesting ways the things which are behind it. So there's a sense in which visual perceptual experience gives us contact with the world. It gives us some kind of openness to the objects in the world. Those objects seem present to us, And there's something transparent about experience itself. Right? When you try and talk about experience, you seem to just find objects and their properties in the world. And the other thing to note is that there's a sort of richness about perceptual experience, or the ways that we naturally want to describe it. So I've mentioned cylindricality when I was talking about the nature of the bottle in front of me, but I also said that it had a blue lid, right? And it looks like the blue lid, right? The fact that it's a blue lid is somehow present to me in experience. So all of those things put together give you what you might call a naive, a pre-theoretical understanding of how visual perception works. Okay, so we're going to call that a naive realist view. And the view is just that in experiencing the world, you are put in genuine contact both with objects in your environment and with many of their features. That gives you a really simple answer to the question of how you know what you do about the world, right? Of the sense in which perceptual experience is a source of knowledge. Because if the bottle is really just a part of my experience, then all I need to do in order to know that the bottle is there is just to accept my experience at face value. So why shouldn't we accept that nice, simple, naive realist position? Well, in the history of philosophy, there are a number of really powerful arguments against it. So, famously, there's an argument from illusion, an argument from hallucination. These are both arguments from error, right? The fact that we can be wrong about our environment makes some people think that perceptual experience can't be as that naive description says it is. And there are also arguments, famously a time lag argument. You might see stars even though those stars blew up millions of years ago. And arguments from variability. When you move around your room, you might think that your perceptual experience of the room is changing, even if you don't think that the nature of the objects in that room is changing. So as you move away from your desk, right, there's a sense in which the bottle looks like it gets smaller. Right? That's something which seems to be a matter of your experience and not a matter of how the bottle really is. So, because we've only got a short amount of time today, I'm just going to pick on one of these arguments, and I'm going to pick on the argument from illusion. So I highly recommend that you go and have a look at some of the fantastic illusions which you can find very easily on the web. They're the kind of illusions that come up now and again on the feeds in social media. So take one of these illusions and think about what it shows us. Okay, so in all of these illusions, what's happening is that you're seeing something, but you're not seeing it as it really is. Okay, you're seeing two lines which are in fact of the same length, but those lines look different in length. Or you're seeing something which is in fact a particular shade of grey, but that object looks to be a different shade of grey. So in all of these cases, what illusions have in common is that you're seeing things, but the way they look to you is not the way they really are. So how does the argument from illusion work? Well, it says, look, you're seeing objects, but not as they really are. So, second premise, you're aware of something, right? A color or a particular shape or a length, but the thing that you're aware of is not really out there. It's not an aspect of the object that you're looking at. Okay, so we're going to call that the phenomenal principle. The phenomenal principle is that when you're in these illusory situations, you are seeing something, but the thing that you're seeing is not an aspect of the object that you're looking at. Now, in those cases, in those illusory situations, if you're seeing something but it's not out there in the environment around you, then it must be somewhere else. Where? Well, we can say that it's mind dependent, it's dependent on your mind, or that it's a mental object itself. It's something in your mind. One way or the other, we're going to call that sense data. So these features which are not out there in the world, but which it seems that you can perceive, are non-physical features. They're sense data. So that's the illusory situation. In the illusory situation, you're not in genuine contact with something out there in the world. You're in contact with something mind-dependent, something that we're going to call sense data. So the argument from illusion then moves on. It says, look, if in that illusory case, what you're in genuine contact with is something mental or mind-dependent, then in all cases of perception, it must be that you are in contact with something mind-dependent or mental. Why? Well, the thought is supposed to be that we understand, if we understand anything, our own experiences, right? Our own experiences can't hide anything from us. So everything there is to an experience is out there on the surface. Now, if you have two experiences, one of which is illusory and the other of which is not, and those experiences seem exactly the same, then, according to this principle, those experiences must be the same. It can't just be that they seem the same but aren't. It must be that they're genuinely experiences of the same kind. So now we get what's called the spreading principle, right? We had to give a particular answer about what you were perceiving in illusory situations. And it looks like that answer is going to spread so that we're going to have to give the same answer in non-illusory situations. In other words, in all cases of perceptual experiences, we're now led to saying that it's not really the objects and features in your environment that you're perceiving. It's mental or mind-dependent objects of which you're directly aware. So the conclusion of the illusion argument, and indeed the other arguments that I mentioned, hallucination, time lag, and so on, is that you're not directly aware of external objects and features in perceiving. You're never aware directly of the things which are out there in your world. So we can call this view an indirect view, but as we'll see later on, right, various philosophers, most notably Berkeley, have said that what we should really conclude is that we are directly aware of the world, but the world itself is mental, is made up of mind-related objects or sense data. So what we're going to do is we're going to call all of these theories that have accepted the indirectness or the mind directness of perception as sense data theories. Now you've got to be a bit careful about that. So if you think about it, sense data is just any data of the senses. So if you were a naive realist, you might think, yes, of course we perceive sense data, and sense data are things like bottles and the features of bottles and books and all the other things in your room. But in philosophy, the concept of sense data tends to be pinned to things which don't have that physical reality. So it tends to be pinned to mental objects, or at least mind-dependent objects, non-physical objects and features of which you can be directly aware. So we've got this sense data theory, and the sense data theory was really the big assumed theory for much of the history of Western analytic philosophy. So in particular in the early modern period, where you move from Descartes to the Enlightenment with figures such as John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume, it was accepted, right, just as an assumption that you're not really directly aware of external physical mind-independent objects around you. That the only thing you can really be directly aware of in perception are sense data, as we're now referring to them, mind-dependent or mental objects. So we turn now to one of the big expositions of how that sense data view of perception could provide us with knowledge of an external reality, knowledge of the bottle in front of me, knowledge of the blueness of the lid of the bottle in front of me. And that comes from John Locke, as was mainstream at the time, assumed that in visual perception, what you're directly aware of are mind-dependent or mental objects that he's going to call ideas. So what do we say about our knowledge of the external world if all we're directly related with are aspects of our internal mental world? So we're going to say that our awareness of those ideas is going to give us indirect, or what you might call mediate or mediated access to that mind-independent world of bottles and lids and books and all of the other things that are out there. So one of the things that's crucial in understanding Locke is to understand his way of thinking about what that mind-independent reality was like. Corpuscularian theories that came before him. And the idea was that the world is made up of invisibly small atoms or corpuscles which combine together in various ways to produce the big, medium-sized objects that we can be aware of in our environment. And this gives Locke a distinction between the primary qualities of the objects around us and what he calls the secondary qualities of those objects. So primary qualities are going to be qualities which are just a matter of how those corpuscles are put together and what the structure of the object that they constitute is. And we can think of things like shape, of mass, of motion, according to Locke, as being among the primary qualities of the objects around us. And he distinguishes those properties from what he calls secondary qualities. And these are really powers that objects have. So the bottle in front of me has the power to produce in me various ideas. And to the extent that it has those powers and those ideas are produced in me, I now have some contact with the primary qualities of the object itself, right? There can't be anything more to the powers of an object, according to Locke, than the primary qualities that it has. But what distinguishes secondary and primary qualities is that where we're thinking about powers, we're thinking about what something has the power to do. And where things like colour come in is that they are the manifestation of the primary qualities of the object to produce in me various ideas. So how does this help us understand how we can get knowledge? Or, as Locke put the question, how shall the mind, when it perceives nothing but its own ideas, know that those ideas agree with things themselves, right? That they match up with the nature of external, mind-independent reality? Well, one argument that Locke gives is that perceptual experiences are both more vivacious, right, more lively than other thoughts and beliefs that we have, and also that we are passive with respect to them. As soon as you open your eyes, you are having perceptual experiences, having these complex collections of ideas, and there's nothing you can really do about it, right? Short of moving to a different room or closing your eyes again, you are passively receiving ideas or passively experiencing ideas about the world around you. So the thought is, there's got to be some external force which is providing us with these vivacious ideas with respect to which we are passive. Right? So Locke says, look, we know that there's a difference between the stuff that we come up with, the ideas that we come up with, the beliefs and the imaginings that we produce, and these perceptual experiences, right? There's something very different about actually getting too close to a fire and getting yourself burnt, and just merely thinking about being that close to a fire. So one of the concerns that you might have, as soon as you think of perception being indirect, as Locke does, right, as being only directly a relationship between you and some of your ideas, is that you might think that this allows or opens up room for skepticism. Now, of course, we are passive with respect to these perceptual ideas, and these perceptual ideas are incredibly vivacious. But in itself, that doesn't give you a cut and dried argument that those are being caused in an appropriate way by objects and features in your external environment. So the skeptic is going to say something like this: all of those experiences that you have could be, for all you know, experiences that are just coming from a dream or coming from some outside force which is not going to resemble or otherwise be represented by the ideas that you have. Now, if you can't rule that out, if you can't rule out the thought that these ideas are not matching up with how reality is, then to that extent, you can't rule in the thought that they really are matching up with how external reality actually is. So that's the skeptic trying to push you towards thinking that if this is what perception is like, if Locke is right about the nature of perception, then perception can't really be a source of knowledge about our external environment. Now, one thing I think that's very interesting about Locke is that he doesn't really seem to care very much about those kinds of skeptical arguments. And the two responses he gives to the skeptic are, on the one hand, the claim that we shouldn't really engage with those kinds of skeptical arguments, and on the other, a sort of pragmatic appeal. Say you've really got someone who you can't convince not to follow those kinds of skeptical arguments. What can you do with someone like that to say it doesn't really matter, or that they should carry on as if skepticism is false? So let's think first about the desire not to really engage with the skeptic. So there's a contemporary philosopher called Tim Williamson, and he provides a very wonderful quotation about skepticism. He says, "Skepticism is really a disease in which healthy mental processes run pathologically unchecked." And I think Locke is going to agree with Williamson on that. He says, look, if you carry on running these kinds of skeptical arguments, then everything disappears. But let's stick with common sense, right? Common sense has it that we do at least sometimes get knowledge from our environment. We've got these excellent reasons for thinking that perception is indirect. So by that, we've got now excellent reasons to think that we can treat perceptual experience as a source for knowledge. Running the skeptical arguments is just playing a game without any practical or helpful or constructive benefit. The other way in which Locke responds to the skeptic is to say, okay, look, you're going to play the game, You're going to run these skeptical arguments. But really what you're left with, if you're not left with absolutely nothing, is something which looks exactly like the kind of structure I am arguing we should accept. Right? It's still going to be the case, even if everything is a dream, that there is a difference between, really, now in inverted commas, putting your hand in a fire, and merely thinking about putting your hand in a fire. So we can draw all of those same distinctions about vivacity and passivity as we can if Locke is right and we're indirectly related to a mind-independent reality. So Locke says, we just shouldn't worry about the skeptical arguments. If the skeptic is right, we've still, for all practical purposes, got everything that we need in order to distinguish veridical, now in inverted commas, perceptual experience from dreams and imaginings and times when things go wrong. So Locke doesn't really say very much to the skeptic. But at the same time, I think what Locke does say is incredibly plausible. Right? There is something very game-like about what the skeptic is doing. And as soon as you stop playing those skeptical games, you go back to needing some kind of account of how perceptual experience can be a source of knowledge for you. I think the real problem for Locke comes from his answer to the question of what perceptual experience is like. On the one hand, perceptual experience for Locke is incredibly thin, right? Remember that the lived experience of perception has it that it's an incredibly rich experience, right? I'm not only experiencing the cylindricality or the various colors that appear to me where the bottle is, but I'm also experiencing things like that it is a bottle, that it has a blue lid, and so on. For Locke, when we're thinking about visual perception, all he thinks we can really say about the content of those perceptual experiences, right, about what they really involve, is that they are patterns of colours and shapes. And that's a very, very thin basis for knowledge of an external environment. The other problem that Locke has is, or comes from, precisely this distinction that he draws between primary and secondary qualities. So while the shapes of these patches of colours might in some sense resemble things, genuinely resemble things which are out there in the world, namely the shapes of objects in our world, the primary qualities of objects in our world, the secondary qualities, according to Locke, bear no resemblance to the nature of external reality at all. When you're perceiving the blueness of the lid, you are representing the power of the bottle and all of its primary qualities, which have nothing to do with colour, to produce in you this blue idea. So there's a sense in which blueness itself isn't really an aspect of the external world. Something is an aspect, this secondary quality, this power to produce in you a blue idea. That's, in an attenuated sense, somehow out there in the world. But the blueness itself is a fiction for Locke. So this makes it very hard to understand how we can really get not just knowledge of what's going on in the world around us, but some genuine understanding of how the world is from our perceptual experience. If our visual experiences are just patterns of colour, and colour isn't something which is a fundamental aspect of the reality around us, then all our perceptual experiences presenting us with are things which are not really fundamental aspects of the reality around us. Building knowledge of how the world works and what the world contains from these very slender and in some respects, fictional ideas that we have is very hard to do. So the real problem for Locke is not skepticism, so far as I'm concerned, but this very thin notion of the contents of perceptual experience. So for those reasons, among others, we might want to reject some aspect of what Locke had in view. And a very powerful set of arguments for rejecting Locke's view were presented by Berkeley, who came just after Locke. So Berkeley assumes, like Locke, that perception gets you only directly hooked up to ideas, to mind-dependent or mental objects. But he uses that thought to argue that to the extent that we have knowledge of the world itself, the fundamental nature of reality, must itself be mental or mind-dependent. After all, we can't get knowledge, he thinks, of the kind of world that Locke thinks is out there, this mind-independent world full of invisible particles and relations we know not what. So Locke had this idea that we were indirectly associated with a world which was very, very different from our natural way of thinking about it. Berkeley, on the other hand, thinks that perception gives us access to the fundamental nature of reality. It's just that the fundamental nature of reality is mental. It is a collection of ideas, of these mind-dependent or mental objects. That view is called idealism or immaterialism. And Berkeley says, to be, to exist, is to be perceived, is to be an idea and hence an aspect of a mind, and in that sense, to be perceived. So all of the objects in our environment, on this view, are objects which are aspects of minds. They are collections of ideas. So I'm going to present a number of arguments that Berkeley gives for this very radical sounding view. And I highly recommend that you go and read Berkeley because he's a fantastic writer. And the place where you can find these arguments is a very short book with brilliantly written and very entertaining and exciting arguments. But I'm going to give you a flavour of how those arguments work now. So here's an initial argument that you might give for the claim that the objects which we have knowledge of via perception are themselves ideas or collections of ideas in a mind. So say you accept, in this naive realist vein, that we do in fact perceive trees and houses and bottles and books and other people. Well, if we accept with John Locke that we only perceive ideas, then it follows that all of those trees and houses and bottles and books and all the rest of it must themselves be ideas. So there's an initial argument that Berkeley presents for why we should think of the world about which we know as being itself a matter of the contents of minds. But I think this initial argument is very easy for someone like Locke to reject. All that Locke needs to say is that we don't only perceive ideas. Right? Remember that Locke's view was that we can only get into direct perceptual contact with ideas. So all that Locke needs to say in response to Berkeley at this point is that we can have indirect or mediated perceptual awareness of things which are not ideas, namely, for Locke, mind-independent, corpuscular bottles, houses, trees, and the rest. So even though that initial Berkeleyan argument is quite tempting and very plausible sounding, I think it's relatively easy to reject. The next argument I'm going to think about is an epistemological argument. So this is an argument that takes you from what you can know, or what you do know, to what there is in reality. Right? In other words, this is an argument which moves from knowledge to metaphysical claims about the nature of reality. And it's a very famous Berkeleyan strand of thinking. So Berkeley does say that the truth of Locke's indirect realism can't be known by experience. Why not? Well, all we directly experience are ideas, and we can't get any independent access to the mind-independent reality that Locke thinks exists outside of us. So experience is not going to give us knowledge of that mind-independent reality. He goes on to say that reason, thought, can't give us knowledge of the truth of that independent reality either. Why not? Well, just think of the skeptical argument. As far as our reason is concerned, it's equally possible that there might be a mind-independent physical reality around us, or that we might be dreaming. Reason can't distinguish those two possibilities, so we can't argue from reason that there is a Lockean mind-independent reality. Now, if neither experience nor reason can assure us that we are indirectly related to Locke's external reality, then this epistemological argument goes, we don't have good enough reason to think that there is that mind-independent reality around us. Now, I don't think that this is a very strong argument either. Right? On the one hand, remember that Locke's dismissive reaction to the skeptic is actually quite plausible. Right? It's quite sensible to be dismissive of skepticism. And if you take into account Locke's other positive arguments for thinking that our experiences give us good reason to accept that there's a mind-independent reality around us, I think Locke can overcome this epistemological concern. Another way of thinking about how Locke can overcome this concern is to think that, well, Berkeley is just begging Locke's question, as philosophers say. Right? For Locke, experience can give us enough justification for thinking that there's an external reality to count us as knowing that there's an external reality around us. And Locke can just dismiss that Berkeleyan claim then that experience doesn't give you access to reality. Right? After all, according to Locke, it gives you this mediated or indirect access to external reality. So a third really interesting strand in Berkeley's reasoning is to think about the interaction between ideas on the one hand, these mental objects or mind-dependent objects, and Locke's physical corpuscular reality on the other. So a general concern when you have two substances of very, very different kinds, right? On the one hand, this physical corpuscular substance, and on the other, this mental ideas-based substance, is the question of how those two substances could possibly interact. Now, Locke has no particular positive arguments for how a physical substance could interact with a mental substance. And Berkeley thinks that no arguments are going to present themselves. Right? We just have no way of understanding how the corpuscles could possibly be responsible for these things which are non-corpuscular, right? Namely ideas in the mind. And if you don't like or you can't make sense of the idea that a physical reality could interact with a mental reality, then you should be a monist, right? So there's a substance dualism that Berkeley identifies in Locke. And if you don't think that that's tenable, if you don't think it's plausible, you should accept one or another form of monism. Now, one form of monism would be to say that everything is physical, right? That the mind as well as external reality is a physical thing. That's very hard to do, even if it's true, because the mind appears so different from Locke's physical reality, right? After all, remember, at least when it comes to visual perceptual experience, right, the manifest nature of that experience, even according to Locke, really has nothing to do with the corpuscular nature of external reality. So if you're not going to be a physicalist monist, Berkeley thinks you should be an immaterialist or a mental monist. You should think that all there really is are the mental things. And there's good reasons to accept that. After all, if there's anything we know most intimately, right, according to this picture, it's the nature of our own ideas and the existence of our own ideas. Now, if we know that those things exist, and we've got good reasons to be monistic, to think that there's only one kind of thing, one kind of substance, then we should think that everything is like ideas in the mind. And I think that's a very, very interesting and surprisingly plausible argument for idealism. But I now come to what gets called the master argument, Berkeley's master argument. Now, we've seen that there's a metaphysical argument going on about the interaction between different substances. And we can think of the master argument as being more of a conceptual or a logical argument for thinking that while perceptual experiences get us knowledge of the world that they get us knowledge of must be a world of ideas, of mental things, rather than of mind-independent physical things. So here's how the master argument goes. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to conceive of an object. Think of a standard object, a book or a bottle or whatever it is. Now hold that in your mind. Okay, if you're holding that object in your mind, then that object is an object which is conceived of by you. It has that property of being conceived of in your mind. But now try and think of that object as being unconceived. It looks as if on the one hand, the object is being conceived of by you, and on the other, you're trying to imagine that that object is not conceived of by anything, right? That it's genuinely mind-independent. And Berkeley says that is just a logical contradiction. You've said on the one hand that the object that you're conceiving of is unconceived, but at the same time we know that that object is conceived of because it's conceived of by you. Now try any object. Any time you think of that object, you will be conceiving of it. And so no object that you can possibly conceive of can be or exist unconceived. In other words, it can't genuinely be a mind-independent object. And the conclusion that Berkeley draws from discovering that contradiction is that for all objects, those objects are mind-dependent. They are things which are conceived of. After all, if you try and conceive of an object which is unconceived, it looks like you are trying to do something contradictory. So Berkeley's conclusion is that we can't even coherently conceive of an external material Lockean world. And that's the crucial reason why he thinks we wouldn't be able to know about it, why perception wouldn't be a source of knowledge about such a world, right? If you can't even conceive of a world, you can't even conceive of having knowledge about that world. And that is the crucial Berkeleyan argument. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us thinking that, on the one hand, the world is made up of ideas, mental things, but on the other hand, it gives us a really natural and anti-skeptical answer to the question of how we can have knowledge by perception. Because the knowledge that we now have is knowledge of this mind-dependent reality. So Berkeley can say something incredibly intuitive about how perception works. He can say, yes, we really do have genuine contact with external reality, with bottles, with houses, with trees. These things really exist. And we can know them as they really are. We can have genuine understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. We just have to conceive of that reality as being mental rather than corpuscular. So why doesn't this lead to a sort of strange, ephemeral solipsism where objects pop in and out of existence whenever you blink? Well, for Berkeley, we've got really good reason, empirical reason, for thinking that objects are held in reality by an infinitely competent and knowing mind. In other words, the mind of God. What's the argument for that? Right? Berkeley doesn't assume that God exists. He thinks he's got an argument for it, an empirical argument for it. And his argument is just that the world seems so coherent. Right? The world is relatively stable. And our weak little minds cannot produce that kind of stability. So we've got an empirical argument now for thinking that there must be a mind far less weak and far less meager than our own, an unblinking mind which is holding everything in this stable way, so that when you close your eyes or when you come back into a room, everything looks much as it did when you left. That mind is the mind of God for Berkeley. And I really want to emphasize that Berkeley is not assuming the existence of God here. He's got an argument for it, an empirical argument that God is the best hypothesis for why our experiences are so stable, so coherent, so complex. Interestingly then, the conclusion of all this is that the objects around us, right, when we're in perceptual contact with them, we are in perceptual contact with the mind of God. And that is a very beguiling and interesting thought, right? Even us, perhaps, or at least the ideas that we have, when everything goes right, are themselves ideas or aspects of God's own mind. So nothing is closed to us on this view. Right? We can really, unlike for Locke, get genuinely engaged with and genuinely in contact with the fundamental nature of reality, which is God. But now I want to think again about Berkeley's master argument, right? This was the crucial argument that concluded that we can't even conceive of a genuinely mind-independent Lockean reality. So I want you to distinguish two different thoughts, right? The argument can seem as if it's insurmountable, okay, at least on first look. But distinguish these two thoughts, right? On the one hand, the thought that you're conceiving of an object and that that object is unconceived of, right? That just looks completely contradictory. Right? Distinguish that thought from the thought that you can conceive of an object as being unconceived. Now that does not look contradictory at all. Right? After all, take any of the objects around you, you can conceive of those objects as being different from they really are. Right? You can conceive of the book in front of you as being red when in fact it's blue. And so just as you can do that, you should be able to conceive of an object as being unconceived of by you or anyone else without getting yourself tangled up in any contradiction. So unfortunately for Berkeley, this turnkey argument that he has, the master argument, really doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work, or the way in which you can see that it doesn't work, is to think of your perceptual experiences as being representations of the world around you. Right? Just as you can truly represent the world around you, or falsely represent the world around you, you can represent the world as being a way that the world is, or a way that the world is not. Now, the sense data view, right, the view that both Locke and Berkeley shared, is something which has very much gone by the wayside in contemporary analytic philosophy. Very, very few philosophers these days are prepared to argue for the claim that what we're directly aware of in perception are sense data. Now, one way of doing that is precisely to think of our perceptual experiences as being somehow representations of the way the world is around us. Remember in that argument from illusion I gave you very near the beginning of this podcast, we moved from the claim that you perceived an object but not as it really was, to the claim that there was an object that you perceived that had the features that you experienced. Right? The object itself had lines of similar length. If you perceived there being lines of different length, it must be that you were perceiving non-physical lines. And if we think of perception as being representational, we can reject that move. In other words, we can reject what I called the phenomenal principle that moves us to thinking that all we're really directly aware of are sense data. How does this work? Well, we think of perceptual experiences as being representations of the world around us, which sometimes get things right and sometimes fail to get things right. So just as you can represent in your mind an object as being unconceived of, even if you are in fact conceiving of that object, you might represent the book as being blue in your perceptual experience, even when that book is not blue. So now we've got an answer to how illusion is possible that doesn't say that we are actually looking at an object which has that illusory quality. All we're doing is representing an object which is in fact there as having a property that it doesn't have. So this intentionalist or representationalist view in perception is the current mainstream. This is how philosophers think about perception these days, or tend to. Nonetheless, there are lots and lots of questions for the intentionalist or the representationalist to answer. Right? There are lots of questions about what the contents are, what the representations look like. Right? Remember that there's a sense in which the bottle looks the same as you move around it, but there's also a sense in which it seems to change, or your perceptual experience needs to change. Right? The intentionalist needs to give you an account of what's being represented in your experience that allows you to understand that duality. Right? On the one hand, this stability of the bottle, and on the other hand, the ephemeralness of your experience. And there are lots of arguments and debates about how an intentionalist or a representationalist could possibly do that. So I just want to introduce you to an alternative view, which is a naive realist view about how perception works, a view on which we can accept all of those properties of experience that common sense gave to us when we were trying to reflect on the nature of experience at the beginning. Remember, I said that common sense has it that perceptual experience genuinely gets you into contact with the way the world is, that objects are really present to you, that the experience itself is transparent, and so on. Now, a disjunctivist is a naive realist who thinks that when things are going well, your perceptual experience really just is a relationship between you and the objects and features in your environment. Right? So those objects, those features, genuinely constitute your experience on those occasions. Right? And remember, that gave us a really nice, simple picture of how you could get knowledge via experience of the way in which your world was. What then do we say about illusion and hallucination and time lags and all the rest of it? Well, the disjunctivist, right, this contemporary naive realist, is going to say that when you're in those situations, you just have an experience of a completely different kind. Right? In those cases, you have an experience which, while it's subjectively indistinguishable from a genuine experience of your environment, is in fact just something to do with your mind. So what are the benefits of being a disjunctivist? Well, when everything goes right, we've got this very intuitive picture of the nature of perceptual experience, and we've got this very simple way of thinking about how that perceptual experience can be a source of knowledge. The problem, of course, is that we have to reject this idea that's been common amongst all of the other philosophers that we've looked at, that there's nothing more to experience than how things seem to you from the inside. Right? What we're saying, if we're disjunctivists, is we're saying that from the inside, you might have two mental states which are of completely different kinds. Right? One, a relationship between you and an object in your external environment. One, something that just seems like that but isn't. And we can't tell in every case the difference between those experiences. So what we gain in terms of an intuitive and epistemically simple theory about how we can be in contact with our environment, we lose in thinking about our contact with our own minds and our understanding and knowledge of the fundamental nature of the mind.
As always, thank you very much for listening, and make sure you tune in to the next episode, in which we'll have Professor Daniel